On July 28, 1914, the world's greatest powers split into two opposing parties. The Allies, who included the United Kingdom, France, and Russia, and the Axis, who included Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, which created one of the most deadliest conflicts in history. The war has witnessed events and traumas that have occurred on the front to the soldiers fighting for their country, fulfilling the rumors that have given this battle the title, the Great War. Soldiers on the front had to live with the terrible conditions of the front and sleeping accommodations for months. The construction of the trenches was a rigorous process featuring the selection of walls. Depending on the condition of the location, trenches were stabilized with sandbags, rocks, sand, or wood. Sometimes trenches crossed towns or industrial works and railways. Talking about the structure of the trenches, they added holes throughout the trenches to be able to equip themselves quickly with weapons. The front line was equipped with rifles on the side facing the enemy. Machine guns also were used on tanks. Tanks were attempts to be used during the war, but they would sometimes sink into the mud and become unusable. As men fought, they pushed into no man's land, which was a wasteland, and had to build new 18-inch trenches. For example, in the area of the River Somme on the western front, the ground was chalky and easily dug. Beside the trenches, the front line had corridors showing enemy lines. And even worse, they had 3 to 4 soldiers squeezed for shelter and support lines. The only way they could get in and out of the trenches was through the battle lines or through the communication trenches that were linked at the rear end of the trenches and allowed men to bring in supplies. But this led to men to use Creocote and even tried to hang their rations. Even though the trenches were a significant part of this war, if there was bad weather conditions, a flood would start, and water and mud started creating moss and viruses and disease. One unknown soldier stated, "Soldiers knew that they could not walk about freely among the exposed trenches. Anyone unwise enough to peep above the front line could expect a well-aimed bullet in the head, as often as it happened." War. Weapons became a man's best friend. Fighting and using these weapons protect their country and themselves from the enemy. Some of their weapons were known as bayonets, flamethrowers, rifles, trench mortars, machine guns, grenades, pistols, tanks, poison gas, and many, many others. Although there were a few chosen weapons that were more significant than others, there were 4 types of poison gas used in World War I: tear gas, chlorine gas, phosgene gas, and mustard gas. Tear gas was the least harmless, but was mainly used for incapacitation. Chlorine gas killed an estimated 5,000, but reduced ineffectiveness after gas masks were introduced. Phosgene gas was even more deadlier and was responsible for 85% of gas-related deaths after being introduced. And finally, mustard gas had a mortality rate of 2 to 3%, but its physical effects were still severe. Horrific bloody massacres, men became immune to shock and eventually started a psychological disorder called shell shock. Shell shock was a great problem during the war, and in the beginning people believed that the reason behind shell shock was physical injuries that they had to face with symptoms like trembling, headache, tendinitis or ring in the ear, dizziness, poor concentration, confusion, loss of memory, and disorders of sleep. But it was later discovered that it was a psychological problem due to the sights and lifestyles that they had to live through. Psychiatrists concluded that the reason behind shell shock was the effect of shells that was thrown at them. Soldiers would have to experience horrible sights and encounter chemicals that affected the brain negatively multiple times a day. Later they discovered that some soldiers who did not even encounter shells were still getting shell shock. This made them realize that shell shock was not only caused by the sights, but also conditions that they had to live through. The cure to shell shock was talking to a therapist, but most cured soldiers went back to fight. Trench life, however, was always one considerable squalor. With so many men living in very constrained spaces, trenches were built in a zigzag, so if a shell were to hit inside the trench, the effect will be minimal. They were built up with wood and sandbags to help maneuver and cover the men while inside the trenches. Trench warfare was made up of a front line and a support line. The front line was for making a defense, while the support line was directly behind, so where the company leader, along with the telephone for communication, were held. For extra protection, they were fortified with sandbags and barbed wire to support the men with cover and defense from invaders. Going on about the conditions of the trenches, they were very constrained and very dirty.
While trenches are usually associated with death, many people argue that the fatality rate would have been much higher without the trenches themselves due to the fact that they need protection from artillery fire. World War I was not the only place where trench warfare was featured. It was featured before in the American Civil War and the Russo-Japanese War, and afterwards in World War II by the Japanese Army, the Korean War, the Iran-Iraq War, and the Persian Gulf War as well. Contrary to popular belief that the trenches were just a pair of ditches, they were in fact actually deep and elaborate systems constructed by generals from both sides.